Teachers, what was the best smartass response from a student you have heard? Story number 1. Let me point out that I'm female since people will assume I'm a guy. I taught in an inner city school. We were talking about prime numbers, so I would have kids give me a number and we'd work out if the number was a prime number on the board. One kid wasn't paying attention, so me being a young teacher, I thought I'd catch him off guard and call on him. It went something along the lines of, "Mark, do you have a number?" "Huh? I need your number." "Shit. Play it cool, girl. We can talk after class." The whole room lost their shit, and I turned red from embarrassment. They then laughed at how red I got. Story 2. This is sort of a flip from the question, but there was this awesome history teacher I had freshman year of high school who was just always in an amazing mood. We'll call him Mr. Smith. One day everyone is sitting in class waiting for the tardy bell to ring when a kid sneaks a condom into the door handle. The bell rings and Mr. Smith walks into the room, grabs the handle to close the door and pulls the condom off of it. Looks at the condom helmet for a split second and stuffs it into his pocket while saying, "Thanks, I'll need this later." Story 3. I had a teacher tell a classmate, "No drinks in class." He got up from his seat, picked up the teacher's drink and deposited it in the garbage with his drink. She sent him to the office. Story 4. Not me, but a colleague told me this story. It was one of his first years teaching, so he was about 22, 24 at the time. It was a junior high school science class and he told a student to stop messing around and get back to work. The student's response? "Man, I got bitches older than you. All I'm looking at right now is a bitch younger than me. Back to work." Story 5. My history teacher would spend half the class making jokes directed at the students. One student in particular always took the jokes on the chin and never really made any comebacks. Eventually, the teacher called him out and jokingly lectured him about standing up for himself. He ended his rant with, "You've got to be a man. You've got to be like me." The student replied, "Well, which one? Do you want me to be a man or do you want me to be like you?" Story 6. I'm not a teacher, but I had a friend in school who was always pretty dramatic. She actually did have IBS though. So we're in this bitchy teacher's class and she keeps asking to use the bathroom. The teacher says no. My friend's like, "I have IBS though." And the teacher's like, "Tell me what those initials mean and I'll let you go." So she screams, "It means I have to shit," and takes out of the room. Story 7. Not a teacher, but witnessed it as a student. There were literally 30 seconds left of class and my buddy started to back up. The teacher didn't seem to mind, but when the bell rang and the buddy got up to leave, the teacher said the classic line, "The bell doesn't dismiss you, I do." And the buddy just continues to leave, getting in the doorway of the class and says, "If it decides when I come, it decides when I leave," and just leaves the class. Story 8. In high school, our functions and relations teacher would always start to say something, forget it, and say, I lost my train of thought. Well, one day a buddy of mine replies, "It's okay, sir. We're no important passengers on board." Story 9. I've told this story on Reddit before, but this really shy kid that doesn't really speak much was getting picked on by this mean girl. When the teacher tells her, "Be nice to him, he might be your boss someday." Without missing a beat, he replies, "No thanks, I don't want to be a pimp when I grow up." Story 10. In my chemistry class sophomore year, one of my friends was going through some family issues, and his dad just left for a year or so. The kid was acting up in class, and the teacher was like, "Do you want me to call your dad?" And he was like, "If he picks up, tell him to come home soon." Story 11. I had a friend who told the teacher he wasn't going to be able to come to an after-school event. She started fussing at him, telling him that he wouldn't ever make it to college because of how irresponsible he was. When she finally asked why he couldn't come, he replied, "My house burned down." Story 12. I had a woman accuse me of sexual harassment in a French class for civil servants. We were just casually trying to have a conversation in French when the teacher asks me, in French, "Have I ever eaten a beaver?" This was in Ottawa during Winterfest. They sell a pastry called a beaver tail. So I respond, in correct French, "What kind?" thinking of the animal or the pastry. Most people were laughing, and this one woman throws a book at me and stomps out of the class. I'm kind of wondering, what the fuck? When it dawns on me. Okay, oral sex on a woman. Anyhow, this woman reports me and tries to get me kicked out of the class. She ended up leaving the class and I found out later she was notorious for bringing sexual harassment suits against fellow employees. I like how it's not okay for you to offend her, but it's perfectly okay for her to throw a book at you. No big deal, right? Story 13. This isn't going to be as good when spoken out loud, But I had a friend who got into an argument with their teacher about the whole I before E except after the C thing. And if it sounds like an A, it's A. My friend told his teacher that it wasn't always true. So she got defensive and started going off about her lit degree and how she knows more than him. His response was, "No, seriously, there are some weird words where that rule doesn't apply." She kept saying it wasn't true, and he kept saying the same thing over and over. There are some weird words where they don't apply. He did like 5 times, and finally she snapped and yelled, "Like what?" He just yells, "Weird." She permanently kicked him out of her class for being a smartass. Well, that's a pretty weird reason to kick someone out. Story 14. I wasn't in class, but my buddy swears that one time his history teacher called a student's mother because he was sleeping in class. He said the teacher got all the parents' numbers at the beginning of the year. I went to a mostly black school, and evidently, this kid had one of those stern black moms. Anyway, the teacher doesn't say a word to the kid, who was asleep. He quietly told the mom he was sleeping in class and would she like to have a word with him about that. He holds the cell phone to the kid's ear and she f***ing goes off. My buddy said you could hear her across the room. That poor kid spent the rest of the day walking the Green Mile. I can imagine the black mom's voice right now. Story 15. This is one of my favorite stories from high school. I'm not a teacher, but this is a story about my teacher's response to one particular smartass answer. So my high school mythology teacher, Mr. D, would have his honors class students help him grade tests from the other classes. He would always require proper spelled right-in answers. No multiple choices for him. So he'd get the tests, he'd read off the answers, and we'd mark them accordingly. One of his questions was, who was the wife of King Minos? Now, according to our Greek lore, Pasiphae, Minos' wife, was the one who had sex with a bull and gave birth to the Minotaur. So Mr. D tells us that the answer is Pasiphae, and one of the students kinda timidly raises his hand. Mr. D goes, "What you got?" They wrote bull slut. The class breaks into laughter. Mr. D grins and thinks about it for a second. I like it. Have credit. That's why he was everyone's favorite teacher. Good sense of humor. And the fact that the answerer knew that Minos' wife was the one who birthed the Minotaur meant that at least some of the mental connections were there. So they got the credit. Great guy. Story 16. I'm a diving coach and have 4 divers I'm responsible for, so I don't usually get swimmers' contact info. We were on our way to a meet and one of our swimmers was not on the bus. I said, "Who has Redacted's number?" No one. So obviously I got mad. "This is your teammate, and not one of you girls has her phone number to text her?" So one of my divers chimed in. "Why don't you, coach?" I said, "I have 4 divers. I don't need another 30 high school girls' numbers in my phone." She replied, "You wish." Easily the best burn of my coaching career. Story 17. When I was in my practice teaching placement, I was teaching a class of about 15 grade 9 students with various learning needs. Most of them had difficulty focusing. There was a pretty strict routine in class, starting with 15 minutes of silent reading. There was a book room, a big closet filled with books, attached to the classroom, and my associate teacher said that if anyone is having trouble staying on task, I could send them to the book room to be away from their peers. One student was acting up, and after the first 2 reminders to stay on task, I said, "This is your final warning. Next time I speak to you, you will be moved to the book room." The student looked up at me with a mock frightened expression and said, "Not the book room, miss. Dark things happen in there." Then he shuddered and stared at me with large frightened eyes until I started to laugh. The class laughed so hard because they had been trying to push buttons all week to get me to lighten up a bit. That is one of the key moments in my practice teaching because that's when I stopped being so nervous about classroom management. Thanks for being a smartass, kid. Story 18. I spent years waiting to use a line on a teacher, and I finally did it in grade 10. I was always late to class, just kind of happened, wasn't a hooligan. And I always had a response in my head for when a teacher would say, "You're late." Although none of them ever did. They all just accepted it. But one day, I was late to English class and my teacher looked at me and asked me why I was late, to which my response was, "A wizard is never late, nor is he early. He arrives precisely when he means to." My teacher, who was a huge Lord of the Rings fan, laughed and told me to sit down. I don't know how that kind of savage can still be a virgin.